Now I would like to welcome Paula Nesbitt of the Episcopal Diocese of California. Paula has served in many roles within the Episcopal Church USA and the Anglican Communion, including the International Anglican Women's Network and the Anglican Peace and Justice Network. She taught and directed an ethics institute at the University of Denver before 10 years at the University of California, Berkeley, and is presently at the Graduate Theological Union. She has also had a number of publications. Paula, we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
The background that you see, a number of you commented on it just before we began, is from a shelter in India for women and girls who have been trafficked or forced into prostitution and who feel that they are ready to come out and to make a radical change in their lives. When I took this photo nearly 10 years ago as an evaluator for the Anglican Communion's Continuing Indaba project, part of which was in India, I was really touched by the lush beauty and surroundings that in itself provided a way of natural healing as these girls, barely into puberty, into young womanhood, get medical attention physically and mentally, counseling, education. They learn new skills, and in other ways to try to help build a new life on the outside. The Church of North India is one of a number of allies of the shelter in their efforts to bring healing and transformation. Sex trafficking, whether it's women and girls or boys or vulnerable men or those people who just don't fit traditional understandings of gender, is one of the many forms of gender-based violence that the 16 Days of Activism campaign has sought to address. I'd like to share a little bit about the history of 16 Days for those who may not be that familiar with the campaign. As Sue had mentioned, it's 30 years old and began as a formal campaign in 1991. It was inspired by the assassination of 3 sisters known as Las Mariposas, or the butterflies, who were part of a political resistance to the Dominican Republic's brutal Trujillo dictatorship. They were murdered en route as they traveled, and it was covered up to look like an accident. But subsequent investigations have pointed to Trujillo himself, who had ordered it. And their murder became a symbol at a time in the early 60s and 70s of an emergent women's movement for resistance to violence, and had been marked informally on the anniversary of their assassination, which was the 25th of November, 1960. 3 decades later, in 1991, 23 women came from different parts of the world to meet and to try to build a global women's rights movement. And the butterflies, the 3 women, offer both an image and a rationale that might be able to unite women everywhere to both the work for justice and to address violence against women. The 16-day campaign itself was developed as a strategic way to increase the awareness of the many forms that violence can take. In those days, it was focused just on women. But violence against women in different regions and contexts, and also to help strengthen people's commitment to work for the elimination of violence. The campaign very quickly was embraced by the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And in 1999, the UN General Assembly designated both the 25th of November and the 10th of December as the International Day Against Violence Against Women and the International Human Rights Day, respectively. The campaign then would stretch between these dates, yet it also includes December 1st, World AIDS Day, and December 6th, the anniversary of the Montreal Massacre in 1989, where 14 women were murdered at an engineering school because of their presence in a traditionally male discipline. Over the past 2 decades, since 2000, awareness has grown of the wider scope of what gender actually means and the many ways in which people can be victimized or abused because of their gender or the different ways in which gender is expressed or lived out. And we see the campaign slowly evolve. By 2005, the campaign was publicly including violence against women and girls, and then violence against women and children, recognizing that boys too were subject to gender-based violence. By 2011, it had fully shifted to activism to eliminate gender-based violence. And this phrase was acknowledged in the opening statement of the letter to the churches of the Anglican Communion following the primates meeting that year in 2011, which is significant in itself that the primates would make a letter focused on gender-based violence, but also to articulate that phrase in the fullness of its meaning. The emphasis on gender-based violence specifically recognizes that men also are subject to it, as mental, emotional, and occasionally physical domestic abuse, and more commonly by other men as brutal acts of dominance and humiliation in prisons or captivity, and even in churches, as the history of abuse towards young boys by clergy and youth leaders has shown across the world, and sadly, towards children in residential schools. The risk of violence increases exponentially for those who are also transgender, homosexual, bisexual, or have other gender or sexual differences. And additionally, for those who are vulnerable, such as migrants and immigrants, those of a minority race, tribe, clan, or ethnicity, or who have a significant disability. The Anglican Communion is one of more than 6,000 organizations across the world who engage in the 16 Days campaign. And this year, Mandy Marshall, our Director for Gender Justice, has lifted up a different perspective of gender-based violence on each of the 16 days as a way to help us live into the various forms that violence can occur based on gender. Day 4 recognized the various points of need and urgency that the Anglican Peace and Justice Network mentioned and embodied in the prayer that we heard a few moments ago. And today's perspective, day 15, comes from a young adult in Pakistan. The prayer is posted on the Anglican Peace and Justice Network's Facebook page and also the International Anglican Women's Network. And I invite you to read it and pray with it, because again, this is from a young woman within Pakistan, and the words and the passion come from a very different place than some of us have experienced. I've engaged with the 16 days over the past several years myself as a member of these women's groups, and also in teaching on gender and women specifically, and in publishing. But this year is the first year that I have actually found myself immersed in it as a personal and spiritual journey. And in some ways, a sort of pilgrimage that I found myself on. Typically, I have tended to think of particular events or campaigns that begin or end in chronological time. You know, we experience something as an event and then consider it over or behind us, and we move on to the next event or act. In this mode of thinking, however, I've come to realize that all experience is therefore marked by loss. Any kind of an experience that is pleasant or may empower us or make us feel more whole, we miss it when it ends, and the danger comes when we try to replicate that experience, sometimes at the mercy or abuse of other people. But this year, thinking of the experience of the 16 Days campaign as a process rather than just an act has been like being pulled into an experiential river with its ebbs and its flows of these various days, and the concerns marked by people who either I have known or I've begun to read and pray and think about in a fresh way. Both the joys that they experience in their own context and the tragedies they live with as well. And I've been changed in a way, perhaps feeling a little more cleansed. And I find that in thinking about this experience as process, it's affected what I'm reading, what I'm choosing to read, what I'm writing, and what I'm pondering throughout the routine of each day. And I've undertaken some writing projects that I otherwise would not have done as a result of that. I'd like to close with just one brief example of a new understanding that or insight that I've had and would like to share, that I think is especially appropriate on this eve of International Human Rights Day. And it's about Alice Mogue, whom some of you may know. She's one of the most inspiring advocates of conflict transformation I've ever met. I came to know her through the Continuing Indaba project in traveling to India, hence the background photo, and other places. This December, she received the prestigious Ebert Stiftung Human Rights Award for 2021. And Phil Groves has posted that announcement along with her acceptance speech on the APJN Facebook website. In her speech, she said that her understanding of human rights comes from her own Botswana culture's value of Botho, and it's spelled B-O-T-H-O, which emphasizes the interconnectedness of all people. For right and just relationships, everyone must value one another's human dignity and treat them with respect. even when we disagree with one another. Human rights laws and language articulated, particularly from a very Western perspective, she argues becomes an important tool for increasing Botho in the world. And in this way, it gave me an insight to how those from different cultures and perspectives who have norms that are similar to Botho can engage in the human rights work without feeling co-opted into a Western framework. They engage in it, but the product, the fruit of what they're attempting to produce is the flourishing of their own culture, particular cultural values. And Botho resembles similar norms in other cultures, such as Ubuntu in North America, both in Canada and the US. Many of the First Nations and Indigenous peoples have similar sense of interconnectedness with other people and with nature. It also intersects with our Western understanding of the inviolability of human integrity that undergirds our notions of fundamental rights. And it resembles our Judeo-Christian understandings of the image of God in all humanity, granted through our creation and our long for messianic reconciliation with God. This Advent, I invite you into a reflection on the transformative process that the deaths of the three women in 1960 have evoked, like their nickname, the butterflies. Their legacy has become a living prayer and a call to action across the world for bringing about right and respectful relationships guided in our faith of God's love for all. Amen.
Thank you, Paula. That certainly has been inspiring, informative, and I'm sure will give all of us much to think about.